Hello everyone, my name is Lukáš Škublík, and today I will introduce you to flexible authentication. In today's webinar, we will see on the basic principles of flexible authentication. We will take a look at the basic configuration, talk about what constitutes a module and sequence, and look at how to configure them. And finally, we will look at some configuration examples. I would like to mention that the entire presentation was created for midPoint version 4.8.3. In the 20th century, authentication was simple, requiring only a username and password. However, the current environment has evolved significantly. Today, there are various authentication methods such as single sign-on systems, multi-factor authentication sequences, social login, identity federation, and more. Traditional username and password approach is no longer sufficient in today's world. The concept of flexible authentication has been introduced in a midpoint since version 4.1. Midpoint is not SSO or authentication server, but most solutions need to use it for end user administrators or at least for the REST service. So midpoint supports different ways to integration such as SAML2, OIDC, LDAP, HTTP basic, but we also have the ability to work independently using a simple login form with username and password. Flexible authentication can also be used for more than just simple user login. Flexible authentication can also be used for the other flows such as password reset or registration confirmation, where we can use different authentication flows for different groups of users. So for password reset, we can use mail nonce for one group of users, and for another group, we can use security questions in combination with authentication of some user attributes. Of course, we can also use different authentication flows for different users groups when logging into midpoint. Authentication methods in midpoint can now be configured in many ways. Basic password-based authentication remains the default, but midpoint offers the flexible to configure and combine multiple authentication modules. There are several authentication modules built in midpoint that can be combined into sequences. These sequences can be used independently for different areas of midpoint where authentication is required. There is a wide range of modules available. The entire flexible authentication configuration is contained with the authentication attributes of the security policy. The basic configuration parts are modules and sequences. Authentication modules are the basic building blocks of flexible authentication. The simplest example of the authentication module is the classic login form found on many websites. Sequence is formed by modules. The authentication attribute also contains the ignore local path attribute, which represents the relative paths that flexible authentication will ignore. For example, it is /actuator/health, where it is possible to check if the midpoint server is started and ready to work. The system configuration contains a reference to the global security policy. This policy can be overridden for some users, but we will talk about this later. As I say, the module is the basic building block of the configuration. Many authentication modules have been added since version 4.1. Each module contains these important attributes. First is unique identifier of the authentication module. It is intended to give the system administrator an idea of the type of module. It is not intended to be used as a user-friendly name for the module. This identifier is also used in the URL, so it should not contain special characters. Attribute focus type is type of forward focus object to which this authentication module applies. Supported values are user type, role type, org type, or service type. For simplicity, we will talk about user. Each module can contain also custom configuration for given type of authentication. Now let's see which modules are currently implemented. The login form module is used for interactive user login using HTML forms. This module represents classic form, username, password login. HTTP basic authentication module is based on RFC 7670. This also uses username and password. HTTP header module is pseudo-authentication for pre-authenticated users. This module is based on HTTP header values. Typically used that authentication is provided by proxy before midpoint, and midpoint gets a username of authenticated user. The SAML2 authentication module supports authentication via identity providers that support the SAML2 protocol. Same as SAML, OIDC authentication module support authentication via identity providers, but this provider must support OpenID Connect protocol. Mail nonce authentication module is typical module that sends a randomly generated nonce in a mail message. LDAP authentication module uses LDAP server for authentication. And Duo module is used for two-factor authentication. Module uses Duo server for authentication via hardware key of mobile phone, tablet, and so on. We can't use it as only authentication module. We need some primary authentication modules such as SAML, login form, and so on. The security questions form module is used for interactive login of a user by answering a set of security questions. We also have a twin to security questions form for HTTP called HTTP security questions module. This module is used for quasi-interactive login of a user by answering a set of security questions, same as for security questions form, but HTTP security question mechanism is similar to HTTP basic mechanism, with one difference: it uses security questions instead of password. The next module is the archetype selection module. During the processing of this module, the user can select archetype that will be used in the following authentication modules in sequence. This module can influence which modules will follow based on the selected archetype, but we will talk about that later. The focus identification authentication module is the module that tries to find the user in midpoint according to the specified attributes. Like the archetype selection module, the focus identification module can influence with modules which follow it based on the archetype of the identified user. The hint authentication module is a special module implemented to be used during password reset. The purpose of the module is to provide the user with the password hint if defined. Attribute verification authentication module can be used in addition to any of the previous authentication modules. The purpose of the module is to check defined focus items for compliance. Finally, the correlation module provides the ability to find the identity or identities of the user object in the midpoint using a correlation mechanism with the authentication process. Some modules have certain limitations. The first is that some of them are not sufficient for authentication, which means that the sequence containing only these modules can never be successful. These modules include focus identification, archetype selection, hint, attribute verification, and dual module. Secondly, we have modules that can't be the first in the sequence or must have at least one module before them that provides user identification. These modules include duo, attribute verification, hint, and mail nonce. In the future, we plan to prepare webinars on configuration of some complex authentication modules. The second basic part of the authentication configuration is sequence. Authentication sequence consists of the chain of authentication modules. The sequence contains the following important attributes. The first is the unique identifier of the authentication sequence, same as for module. It is intended to give the system administrator an idea of the purpose of the sequence. It is not intended to be used as a user-friendly label. The second attribute is the required assignment target and represents that this authentication sequence is only applicable to users who have an active assignment with this target and relation. If the sequence is attempted on the user who does not have this assignment, the authentication will fail. The next attribute is node group, which is similar to the required assignment targets attribute, but works with reference to the archetype. Node group means that this authentication sequence will only apply to node that have an active assignment with this archetype. Focus behavior update attribute is only option for updating focus authentication behavior attributes. Behavior container contains basic authentication information such as last success, last fail login, number of unsuccessful login, and so on. The next attribute is channel, which represent the scope for which the sequence will be applied. And last is module, which represent all the modules that will be used for the current sequence. These are important attributes of the sequence. In addition to these, the sequence contains attributes such as description, display name, documentation, and so on. A channel represents a part of midpoint to which a particular authentication sequence applies. A sequence channel contains three important attributes: channel ID, URL suffix, and default. Channel ID represents URI of the specific part of midpoint. For example, channel may be associated with GUI, REST service, reset password, registration confirmation, self-invitation, and so on. The URL suffix attribute is used in the URL during the authentication process to identify the sequence. The URL suffix attributes can be used to select this authentication sequence. If we have configuration for sequence with identifier admin emergency that contains value emergency as URL suffix, then we can directly use the sequence by URL that you can see. As attribute default specifies whether this sequence is the default sequence for a specified channel defined by channel ID. The default sequence is selected if a specific sequence is not requested using the URL suffix. If this attribute is not present and only a single sequence is defined for the channel, so we only see one sequence with the same channel ID, then that sequence is considered the default. If more than one sequence is specified for the channel, none of them will be considered as default. In this case, this element must be used explicitly. As a result, our configuration must contain at least one default sequence for a channel ID of the part we want to use. The specification of the authentication modules in the sequence includes the following important attributes. Identifier is a reference to the authentication module identifier. The value of this element must match the identifier of the existing authentication module. The authentication modules are evaluated in sequence or in parallel if possible. Parallel evaluation is only allowed for the REST and actuator channels. The order attribute is the order number of the module. The modules are sorted according to this number. For parallel evaluation, the module must have the same order. The last important attribute is the necessity. Specify whether the module is mandatory or optional. Supported levels of necessity are sufficient, required, requisite, and optional. The first type of necessity is sufficient. The module is sufficient for the authentication to success. It is not required for success. If this module success, the evaluation stops. The result is a pass. Other modules are not evaluated. Expect when the required module that was previously evaluated has failed. In this case, result is failed. And if this module fails, the evaluation continues. Other modules will be evaluated. The second type of necessity is required. The module is required. The module must pass for the entire sequence will be successful. If this module is passed, the evaluation continues. Other modules will be evaluated. If this module fails, evaluation continues and other modules will be evaluated, but the final result of the authentication sequence is fail. Next value is requisite. The module is required. The module must pass for the whole sequence to pass. If this module passes, evaluation continues. Other modules will be evaluated. If this module fails, the evaluation stops with the error. It is different from required necessity. So, if this module fails, evaluation stops and other modules are not evaluated. The final result of the authentication sequence is fail. As value of necessity is optional, the module is optional. It is not required for success. Optional module has no real effect on the outcome of the authentication, but it can be used for add some authentication attributes. If this module succeeds, the evaluation continues. If this module fails, the evaluation continues. The result of the sequence is only a fail if this is the only module in the sequence and it fails. Now we can look at some example for using of necessity. In the first example, we have three modules, all of which have necessity as sufficient. As we can see, if one of the module fails, the evaluation continues with the next module. If all of them fail, the whole authentication fails and the flow is restarted. If any of the module succeeds, the evaluation of the module stops and the authentication succeeds. In the next example, we have three modules, one of which is required and two of which are sufficient. As we can see, if the required module fails, the authentication flow will continue, but the authentication result will still fail. If the required module succeeds, then we need one more successful module from the two sufficient modules for the authentication to success. In the last example, we have three modules, one of which is requisite and two of which are required. As we can see, for the authentication result to be successful, all modules must succeed. If any module fails, the authentication will fail. We can see that if a required module fails, the authentication continues. But if a requisite module fails, the authentication is immediately terminated as failed. Since midpoint 4.7, it is also possible to define security policies for organization units and structural archetypes. So we have now three places to configure it globally in the system configuration, in the organization unit, and in the structural archetype. All security policies applicable to the user are merged. Merging takes place after user identification, so after the first module to find a user in the system. All security policies defined in the specified objects are merged into one in such an order that security policies closer to the user have higher priority. This means that the user archetype security policy can extend override a super archetype security policy. Super archetype security policy can extend override an organization security policy, and organization security policy can extend override a global security policy. When merging the authentication configuration, any authentication module that wasn't defined in the previous security policy is added to the list of the authentication modules that can still be used in the authentication sequence. The module identifier is used to analyze whether the module is already defined or not. When merging authentication sequences, the algorithm looks for sequences with the same identifier attribute and collect all modules defined for this particular sequence among all security policies. The modules are then ordered according to the order attribute value of the module. If the module with the same identifier is fulfilled in the more prioritized security policy, it will override the value of the previously defined module. Now we can see on some examples of configuration. This is one of easiest configuration. We can see one module for basic username password form and one sequence that use this module. We can see that sequence is configured for GUI and isn't default, so we can show it via URL suffix. And we see that this sequence works only for users that have assignment for given role. In this case, it is super user role. Of course, our configuration have to contain another default sequence for GUI if we want to use GUI as end user. It's really good practice add this configuration as the emergency access for login. Before we starting configure own authentication sequence and do some mistake preventing login. Now let's look at a slightly more complex example. In our example, we have a global security policy that contains only an identification module and the classic login form module for username and password. Then we have a super archetype that contains an additional module that verifies the attribute of the user. And finally, we have the archetype that extends the set of attributes for attribute verification. For this complex demo, I prepare short demo. So we go to midPoint. First, we log in as administrator when only the global security policies use it. So we only need to set the username, and on next screen we set password. We can look at our security policies. So we go to repository objects, we select security policy, and as first we open the global security policy. We can see that this security policy contains more authentication sequences. We see authentication with identifier admin GUI default. This is configured for GUI. Another sequence configured for REST, and last sequence configured for Actuator. For us, only sequence for GUI is important. So we see that identifier is admin GUI default. We see that our sequence contains two modules. One is focus identification with order 1, and second is login form with order 2 and necessity sufficient. We can go back, and a second we open security for super archetype. We see that sequence contains same identifier. It is admin GUI default. Sequence contains configuration for login form, but changed necessity to required. In previous security policy, it was sufficient. And also we see new attribute verification module with configuration for one attribute, and it is date of birth. Now we can go to last. and show policy for archetype. And we see that doesn't contains any sequence. It is because archetype doesn't change module in sequence, but only change configuration for attribute verification module. So this policy at attribute birth city and attribute birth country for verification module. Our environment also contains two users with archetypes that use our policies. So come try to log in with these users. I will go as administrator. As first, I select super archetype user. And on next screen, I have to set password. For simplify, we use same password for both users. So same password as administrator. We set it, config. And now we see panel with attribute verification where we need to set a date of birth. So I set it. And config it. And now we are logged in midPoint. Next, we try second user. So we set name is archetype user, and we set same password. And now we see that we need to set 3 attributes as we configured in third security policy. So this attribute is date of birth, city of birth, and country of birth. I set it. City of birth is Bratislava and country is Slovakia. I confirm it, and now I am logging to midPoint. And this is all from my short demo. Now we can go back to our presentation. So to conclude, flexible authentication can provide more options for authentication. Flexible authentication can provide different authentication flows for different users. You can use it for more flows such as access to GUI, reset password, config registration, identity recovery, and so on. And everything should be documented, so please have a look at the dots. We also plan on next webinars. On 30 May, we'll be hold a webinar with the topic ISO 27001 compliance with midPoint, and last intermediate configuration training teaser webinar is planned for 20 June. Thank you for your time. You can follow us on our social media